So welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm not confused about the times, but this is a typical Zoom event which links together very far away time zones and places. I'm very happy to welcome all our guests here who are joining us from Los Angeles, Berlin, and I'm sitting in Oldenburg. We are really pleased to gather you together on the occasion of the celebration and launching of the new artist book by Kim Schoen, which was published by the Ex-Artist Books. And the Baragouin, which is the title of the book, is also the title of the installation, the mixed media installation, which is currently on display in the Edith-Russ-Haus in Oldenburg. My name is Edith Molnar. I'm the co-curator and co-director of the Edith-Russ-Haus with Marcel Schwinin. And today I have the pleasure to welcome all of you. First, I would like to introduce our nice guests. Kim Schoen is the artist is with us. Alexandra Grant from Ex-Artist Book and Edward Sterrett from the author and the researcher of the publication. Kim Schoen is an artist working in video installation, photography and texts that engages the rhetoric of display. As she stated in her artist statement, her absurdist experimental approach takes on objects and language that try to persuade or convince us of something, using them as raw materials to say something new. Schoen has exhibited in various venues, the Mocca Moskowitz-based Los Angeles Museum, the Arte Contemporanea at the Roma, South London Gallery, Whitechapel Gallery and MOT International London, Kunstverein Springhornhof, Kleine Humboldt Gallery Berlin, and Young Projects and Richard Teller's Fine Arts in Los Angeles. Her work is included in private and public collections, has been written about in the Art Forum, in the Art in America and Mus magazine, and in the Los Angeles Times. Her own writing appears and can be found in the Extra Contemporary Art Quarterly. And Kim is also a co-founder and publisher and editor of Material, a journal of writing by artists. She lives and works in between Berlin and Los Angeles. Alexandra Grant is the founder and director of the Ex-Artist Books. Welcome. She's also an artist who, through the exploration of the use of text and language in various media, painting, drawing, sculpture, film, and photography, probes ideas of translation, identity, dislocation, and social responsibility. Grant frequently collaborates with other artists, writers, and philosophers. She's interested in the ways in which artists and writers work to create and influence culture in an increasingly technology-driven world. Edward Sterrett is with us, who was the writer of the book and the researcher working very closely with Kim. He's an artist, art historian, educator living in Los Angeles. He's currently teaching modern and contemporary art history and working on several writing projects that addresses the collection, exchange and display of art objects. The book Baragouin, which will be the topic of our conversation, was designed by Ella Gold, a Los Angeles-based designer who is specialized on printing media and publications. And I also welcome Mattis Osterland in the background, who is our colleague who will help us with the technical assistant tonight. First of all, I wanted to introduce a little bit our grant program because it tells a lot about how we actually started to work with Kim together about the Baragouin installation. And also later on a little bit, I would like to elaborate on the exhibition Language for Sale, which actually premiered the project. Because the Baragouin is not just the title of the book, but it's also the title of the central installation by Kim Schoen within the Language for Sale. The Edith-Russ-Haus was opened in 2000, and from the very beginning of the existence of this not-for-profit art space that belongs to the city administration of the city of Oldenburg in North Germany, had a fortune of getting that we could start a grant program. The Cultural Ministry of Lower Saxony had a foundation which is called Stiftung Niedersachsen, and actually they provided us with 3 grants per year to facilitate and manage the production of new artworks. We found this an incredibly fantastic match, the way in which the art space is working, because we also considered this grant not just one of the ways how we can facilitate the commissioning of new artworks. But the way how we work with the grantees is really inspiring in the way how we actually build up the whole program of the exhibition house. So in 2019, Kim Schoen was one of the three grantees of the Media Art Grant. And from the very beginning, she actually proposed to work on a multimedia art installation under the title Baragouin, which is the French for nonsense. And we spent a lot of time working together on conversing also the different topical issues which actually occurred to her through the research. Just using a metaphor, how we imagine this kind of particular situation, how we work with the artists. From art history is kind of known that there was a very inventive experimental art museum director in the region. His name was Alexandra Grant, who worked as the director of the Landesmuseum in Hanover in the 20s. And he described the museum, the role of the museum within society as a Kraftwerk, as a power plant that has to feed with inspiration and openness and be the engine of also public life and conversations around culture. And I know it sounds a little bit megalomaniac, but I always thought that this is how we consider our grant program, that the work and the conversations that we could have the fortune to have with our grantees really are the real engines of the whole programming of the Edith-Russ-Haus. So when we got involved with this, with Kim's work, and followed all the different researches she's been going through, and got familiar how she works with the phenomena of nonsense in the past 10 years, we realized that there are so many different common interests we have in this extremely relevant question within our society. So basically one of the registers which really caught our imagination was her fascination with the moment when language really loses its sense. We invited several of her previous works to be also in the exhibition. So within the language for sale, we can also see this development, how she actually analyzed the question of nonsense, and especially she analyzed the question of nonsense in public speech and also in political speech, in the way how in public space we articulate ourselves. And I think it's really kind of a commonplace to say that we have a serious crisis with public speech in the past couple of years. And of course, the way how we accept certain rhetorical formulations coming from politicians and politics in general is rather astonishing. And if you think about how actually the classic art of rhetoric is constituted, so the way of how rhetorical speech has to appeal in three ways to the listeners. It has to appeal through the character, the ethos of the speaker. It has to appeal to our cognitive capacity through logos, through the logical argumentation it wants to convey, but it also has to appeal to our emotions. So this is the pathos part of rhetorical expression. And what we experience is how this balance of this very fragile kind of equilibrium is completely out of balance, and how the emotional appeal and character is taking over when we think about public speech. And these works that we see actually now on the monitor, the Considering the Scrimmage or the Horseshoe Effect, are wonderful previous works by Kim, which I really detect this and actually express the strength of nonsense in a speech act. But going further, other than the crisis of public speech, we were also really inspired by the early works, how she could put hysterical speech or confessional speech into the center. And if you think about that, we are a media house and we work a lot with, of course, our medialized daily life. A lot of her works, the way she actually approached this question of expressing ourselves in public, reminded us how extremely pathological examples we see about public speech in the social media sphere, for instance. So all these different elements came together, and then we decided that we would like to build up a line which also involves historical pieces. We have a Hungarian documentary from 1973 by Elemi Ragai in the exhibition, or we have a historical television production documentary by Harun Farokhi from 1984 also in the exhibition. Because when we talked about what the phenomena of nonsensical speech in public space also entails, Kim always highlighted how important to acknowledge that nonsense always appears in a rather dramatic force in historical times when ideological and societal shifts and transitions are happening. So for instance, the Harun Farokhi piece and both the other documentary by Elemi Ragai both pinpoint a certain historical time when this political shift and ideological shift can be very easily detected. So basically these were the different elements that we wanted to talk through within the Language for Sale exhibition. I'm sure that later on we will also talk about this. But now let's start our conversation just focusing on the Baragouin. And at this point, I would like to give the platform to Alexandra Grant to tell a little bit about how, as a publisher project and a publishing project, she started to work with Kim, how the idea of the Baragouin as a book came about.
Thank you so much for having us all this evening and this morning in Los Angeles. I have been, like you, very impressed with Kim's work for many years and know Kim originally from Los Angeles and had the pleasure of coming and working in Berlin last year and catching up with Kim and her practice in Germany and really observing how the context, the cultural, national context, had encouraged her curiosity about issues of translation and mistranslation, and also given that the kind of gaze that you get when you're at a distance from the city or the place that you live normally. So we were both here having coffee, and she described the project with you, both the installation and the book. And I, like him, used to love the statue shop in Los Angeles. It was at a very, very highly visible, trafficked street corner in Chinatown. And when I first moved to LA in 2001, Chinatown was the center of the art world. It was the most exciting row of galleries, and you would find parking maybe 3 blocks away, and you would walk by this statuary store. And it was the contrast between sort of the intention of going to this neighborhood to see the cutting edge of contemporary art and to see where all the thinkers were. And you would pass this, literally pass by the thinker, I think I just saw go by. And I had never articulated what is so beautifully articulated in the film, as well as by Edward in the writing, which is the collection of knowledge that was present in this sort of garden or decorative statuary store. So as Kim began to describe this project, I thought, this is such a wonderful artist book, and explains and gives expression to something that is a very specific historical moment in the history of Los Angeles, sort of the urban landscape, but also because of the thoughtfulness in the play between Kim and Edward, teases out a sort of a dictionary, a playful Borgesian dictionary of forms that plays with the importance of knowing art history, plays with the sort of language of provenance, documentation, and brings joy to me, to a memory, and also a very important part of practice. So when it was a real pleasure for us at Ex Artist Books to become the publisher of what was a fully formed project, so I can only say that it was our honor to participate in making the book And we only brought, I think, some cheerleading to it. So I think that Kim and Edward, thank you so much for expanding, again, what I think a book can be and do. And it's been really wonderful to have it come into the world, both through the exhibition and through the book itself.
So thank you, Alexandra. I thought to step back because I just realized that I actually talked a lot about the question of nonsense and how this particular register of the Baragouin inspired us to make the language for sale. But we have to step back, and I would like you to, Kim, to join in and give a little bit of introduction about the Baragouin as an installation and how the installation relates to the book.
So I would love to talk a little bit about, thank you, Edith. Love to talk a little bit about the project Baragouin. I was given the grant in 2019, and actually the interruption of the pandemic year provided a nice long production process to really let the project come to its full fruition. And so from about 2019 until now, I've been working on the video installation and the book. As Alexandra mentioned, I had my studio in Chinatown for about 10 years and would always walk by this store and kind of poke around, and was completely fascinated with it. And after a while, I asked if I could film in there. I didn't really know what I was going to make or do, but I just knew that I wanted to record what was in that store and how it looked. And they were nice enough to let me in. So the project began with this fascination of this cacophony of statues and sculptures in one place from all different art historical registers. It was a kind of melee, a mise en scène that had a lot packed into it, under the sort of language of commerce, like the lingua franca of commerce that allows all of these things to coexist and make sense in there. That it was a store helped it make sense, I suppose. So the fascination with the assemblage of sculptures was really the impetus for me to start shooting in there. And when I approached Edward, he was working at the Getty at the time, and I said, I'm fascinated by this space. I've begun to film in there. Would you be interested in developing a kind of provenance for these works? Because I think they're so anonymous and there's so little information given in the store or available to anyone. The impulse was to kind of deepen people's understanding of what was there, and all of the references, influences, idiosyncratic histories of these pieces, which really did kind of draw me in. It captured my imagination. So that's how we started working together. Luckily, he took a leap of faith and was game to jump on this train, which was a kind of absurd endeavor to begin with. But he was so open to it, and only I felt an art historian could bring, the depth of knowledge necessary to sort of unearth a lot of the influences and the histories, because in some cases they're, and we can get into this, Edward, when we talk about it, there are like copies of copies of copies, and some instances there are direct copies. In some instances, the idea of the copy is complicated by the iconic nature of some of the figures. And so, he started work on it. And just to jump ahead to how the installation was created, the provenance, we established a country of origin for every figure, and that's how I based the beginning of the audio portion of the video on. The voices that you hear are based on the initial point of origin perhaps, of each sculpture. So it's a 5-channel audio installation. You see here the video projection on the floating screen, but it has a 5-channel audio, and I worked with Manuela Shanina on the audio as we recorded all a voice for many of the sculptures in the space. And this kind of cacophony was created through this 5-channel surrounding sound. And the speech in it approximates language, I would say, the way the sculptures are approximating a certain genre. It has a kind of relationship to the image in that sense. We did endemic sounds, so it looks like it's coming from the figures themselves, like in a cinematic way. And the speech was generated through sounding like sense, which is a topic I'm very interested in, when things approximate or sound as if they are sensical, but they are not. And so, yeah, this was a process of layering and building in the mise en scène through sound, through the voices of the sculptures, and also each figure, even if it doesn't have a voice, has a frequency, and the 4 walls of the space have a frequency. So this really interested me too, this transition between noise and sound and language, like when something becomes articulatable or recognizable as language. So yeah, that's how it came together. And the book Edward was working on concomitantly as I was putting together the sound for the installation. So yeah, we can talk about the book in further detail.
Can I just still ask something about the voice artist? Because when we talk about nonsense, in that case, it means that you invited special, like people who has this incredible capacity of imitating language, but it's just, they don't necessarily speak this language, but it sounds like the language. So you try to match the sculptures, like if there is a fake Italian Renaissance sculpture, then the person's supposed to speak in Italian, but not, it's just the faking of it. How could you find these people? Because it is very known that producing nonsense is extremely difficult. We are
Yes,
making machines, so you have
yes.
fantastic anecdotes about it.
In my previous works, I cast for people who could try to speak without meaning, and we can talk about that when we talk about maybe the earlier works. But in Baragouin, the language is constructed in many different ways. Initially, my attraction was to people who imitated just orally the sounds of different languages, you know, through a kind of syllabic gibberish that mimics the cadence of the language, the intonations of the language, the flow and the pacing of the language, but did not have recognizable words. So in Baragouin, there is language such as that. I think the Italian is that. They're not real words at all. Some of the other languages are in fact actual words, like the French is, and some of the other languages, but they were constructed with Greek text and like lorem ipsum, which I thought was a kind of funny thing because many of the point of origins was Greek sculpture. So to have Greek text as the script was interesting to me. And you can create Greek text in any language. So some of the languages are generated this way. And some of the languages like the Turkish, there was a lot of improvisation from the speakers. She actually invented a song for the Turkish on the spot. So everything was kind of improvised in the moment with the recordings. And some, like the Pali and the Chinese, I think they're just syllabic mishmashes. They were also invented by one of the speakers as he read them. So yeah, the languages were all created in different ways. And I don't know as a viewer that you would necessarily know that they weren't Chinese or Italian unless you're an Italian speaker, or you know, it's only when you hear your own language in the piece that you think, hang on a minute, like the English is not English words in some cases it is, but the ordering, the construction is completely confounding and would never have a thread of meaning in it. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious as viewers how people engage with it. You know, if you're multilingual, then the nonsense is heightened even more because you realize you take it in on many different levels. So.
And my next question would go to Edward. Did you find this situation a bit nonsensical, like being a serious scholar and being approached by an artist who actually would like to invite you to make serious research on objects which which are originated not from necessarily from the high art and museological context?
Yes, is the short answer. I don't know how serious of a scholar I am, but I do serious scholarship. But there was well, Kim used the phrase just now, as if. I think a lot of things operate as if they were something in this project. There's a kind of almost. So what ended up happening was that I think that a kind of fictional art historian emerged from what I was doing, because we worked it out as we went along. I feel like at first maybe Kim she wasn't totally sure what she wanted from me, and she definitely needed someone who could tell her what language these objects should speak, right? There was this sense that each one should have a particular specific language. And so part of tracing where these objects came from was about finding what language they should speak. And then the fact that that would involve a lot of work was also opened this possibility of there being some kind of publication in relationship to it. And it was still kind of unclear exactly how all of that would work. And so we were negotiating, basically, in a sense, like, what is it that's happening? What is it that I'm doing that's actually helpful? What's coming out of it? And as it began to grow, a certain absurdity, which is endemic to the piece, began to emerge in the work that I was doing. And I think we both took an interest in that. And as a result, there are two Edward Sterretts in this work. One is a kind of out of control art historian who's desperately trying to tell you why these objects carry the details that they do and what kind of coherence might emerge from them. And another one who becomes reflective and writes an essay about it, and who wants to, on one hand, do the diligence of explaining the work in the sense in which an essay might, but also investigates its own kind of complicity and confusion in the work. I think that Alexandra's, description of a kind of Borgesian process is, I'm flattered, but I think that's pretty correct. With the labyrinth of one's own, mind, in a sense, the absurdity of that space, I think, takes over. So I really felt like the project inhabited me in a way that, broke up several identities and forced them to operate simultaneously and sometimes against each other.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of unity of an identity is like, I think that's a really wonderful way to put it, because there's so many influences in those sculptures that some of them are untraceable, and it's so idiosyncratic that, that it disrupts this narrative that there is one genre or one kind of, trajectory for a work. So it's interesting to me that you say that it kind of exploded your own identity in doing it. I watched that happen.
Yeah, we're very transparent with each other throughout the
I know, exactly. I love to work like this in general, to start with an idea and then just see what happens. Like all of my previous works are constructed in the same way. Like the previous nonsense works like Consider the Scrimmage or Horseshoe Effect, they all started in the same way, which is really to have no intention except one singular thing, to see what would happen if. And so that's why I love working in this experimental way and being open to what forms emerge from that. So yeah, this was just a more complicated version of that because there were so many layers to it.
I also find it fascinating how the Baragouin actually find this very nice oscillation between language of irony and humbleness. Can you talk a little bit about how actually Edward also used fantastically humor within the descriptions, the way how you actually, your kind of pseudo scholar tries to find the real proper description of the objects, but at the same time, the contemporary Edward is always kind of look at us in between the lines and try to make sense of it, but also with the help of some humor. But I just would like to ask about your opinion. Did you felt this kind of humbleness of approaching this particular shop? At the end of the day, we talk about a gift and garden sculpture shop, with the humbleness of a scholar and an incredible curious artist who also doesn't just want to see where these objects are coming from, but what kind of need we have for culture, which actually manifests that there is a market for these objects. Can you talk about this story within?
Yeah, well, it starts really with, it took me a moment to see the way that those two identities might have split, those two perspectives. And I think the crucial moment is when you realize, which for some might be quicker than others, that I was never in the shop. I never had, I mean, I passed by the shop in the same way that Alexandra described previously. But by the time I was doing this project, it's not like I had any kind of access to the shop or to the materials outside of what Kim had captured, right? So already there is no original. I can't approach the object as an art historian because I don't actually have documentation of it that an art historian would have. I can't see it properly. Some objects I could see better than others, but I literally did descriptions of objects where all you could see was like a quarter of the back of its head or something like that. And it's like, well, that hat sort of looks like, so once you get away from could we just borrow your art historical expertise to help come up with some idea of where these things came from, and into this idea that you're producing art historical narrative about these objects, the absurdity of that kind of intervenes and produces this split. But it's also it's very easy, I think, to kind of make fun of the messiness on some level of these objects and of the art historical absurdity of trying to identify them, and to miss the fact that there is a real world in which these objects operate. And I think that tension is where the tension between sort of humor and humility operates, is that there's a kind of fascination for these different forms of cultural object, and some of them are religious objects, essentially. You know, whether it be like angels or figures from classical Buddhist statuary and so on, the fact that they're available in a garden store actually doesn't detract from the religious value of the object for someone who might buy it for that reason. So the conventional art historical idea of something having value because it's an original object that was produced by a specific artist at a particular moment is a different kind of value than the value that gives an object religious, a kind of cultural value that comes out of religious associations. So that's another thing that happened as we were traversing this material, is like the humility comes out of understanding how many different valences of meaning extend out of these objects, and not all of them are just sort of, not all of them are parody, essentially, at all.
Yeah, I would echo that, because that's never been the intention behind the work, that kind of irony. I personally not interested in it. I think, like, I was interested in knowing more, just period, end of the story. Like, what might we learn from our connection with why we want these objects? Like Edward said, I think any consumer object holds a wealth of desires and repressed things, and like, there's just a lot going on in any commercial object, and we are contributing as consumers to that. It's a dialogue between us and those objects, and I think there's so much that's sincere about our desires about that. And like, in critiques of late stage capitalism, it's easy to be like, everything is terrible about it and it's all wrong. But no, we are participating in it for very sincere reasons, whether it's attachments to ideas, or to religious ideas, or to beauty, or to like a sense of culture in writ large. Like, the kitsch object actually functions on a very meaningful level for all of us. So yeah, for me, I think it was more the way I chose to film it as well, like the light hitting the objects in a certain way. Just as a note, it was, the timeline is constructed, I shot from like mid-afternoon to evening, so it is a sort of temporal trajectory from daylight to nighttime. And I tried to make the film as beautiful as I felt the space was, like the kind of enchantment that I felt when I was in there. I mean, those windows with the curved tops, it had an echo of the Musée d'Orsay to me. Like, I mean, there's a grandeur in that space that I thought was beautiful, even though it wasn't up, kept up as maybe the Musée d'Orsay is. It's the architectural quality of the space had an impact, and it has an impact when you're in it. And I think the play of light and sculpture was interesting to me, to try and bring out the kind of dreamier qualities maybe of the objects in there. So yeah, I mean, just that's just a note to say, like, that our complicity with them, our interest in them, all of those things I wanted just teased out of them. And I think that's where Edward did such a beautiful job, because like, you actually do learn about a lot when you're reading each history and provenance of each sculpture, and the details that are like the punctum in the Roland Barthes sense of the sculptures, like a hairstyle being wildly out of place for a certain genre, those do come through as moments of humor, because you think, how and why could that have occurred, and those are the questions, I think, where humor comes in, and where Edward could never fabulate where that happened, like there's a limit to your inventive provenance in that sense, don't you think? I mean, we didn't try to really understand that. We did provide visual references, like a Fassbinder still, that reflected a period hairstyle or something like that. Yeah, and the images in the book are used as footnotes. We reversed it and sort of had the images work as the detailed footnotes. So you can see both the sculpture that's in the shop and in its lineage, invented lineage that Edward worked on.
And I'm wondering how Teresa find its way to the exhibition. Probably you remember when we showed some images from the Edith-Russ-Haus installation, Actually, there is a little garden sculpture called Teresa within the show. It's a terracotta piece. And Edward, you also wrote the museum Zettel, as it's in German, for this particular object. Can you tell
Yeah,
why Teresa is there?
why it's there. Well, this tension between a commercial object and a museum object is obviously like present throughout the piece, and having a physical representation of that in the space, I think, is a kind of a more tangible jolt to a viewer, to say like, okay, here it is, and here it is in the space. And I think, you know, you can get yeah, I mean, your imagination is captured through that too, like of actually seeing it. Like I really love the way she was constructed, and we left it on a dolly and with the strap on it and the slink that was from a garden store called Slink in Oldenburg, where the museum is. Yeah, there's a shot of it. Just to sort of, that's how it arrived, and so we just kind of left it in that form. But yeah, I think having a physical representation, just the scale alone and the bodily encounter that you can have with it provides, I mean, I think all video artists are like frustrated by some degree to the two-dimensional world they inhabit. So maybe there is some need to not have a flat object in a space, but just to encounter her, I think, was in that space a good thing.
Actually, the way the audience can encounter this particular object is a moment of uncanny, to be honest, because if it would be just in the garden, it's a very different situation. But within
Yes.
the exhibition space, the incredible out of proportion quality of the object really comes through, because this is a nude young lady, but the size is like of a midget. It's like a 5-year-old kid, but the proportion is an adult person, so we don't have the big head of a kid. And when you go very close to the sculpture, you realize what does it mean when actually it lost the kind of the traditional sculptural feel to proportion. So it's a
Yeah, it's a
very, very
shock. It's a
weird.
shock to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a jolt, because if you saw it in a garden, you wouldn't question its histories. But as soon as you put it in the context of the museum, you're like, why and how was this constructed? And like, how odd is it, the scale and this scenario, that she's sitting on a kind of modernist plinth, also like the rectangular object. Yeah, there's a lot of inconsistencies to why it exists the way it is in a museum that you wouldn't question in a garden.
And I also have a question to Alexandra. How do you imagine the audience? And also it's a question to Kim for the book. Did you have an imaginary kind of reader who could actually delve into such an absurd endeavor, which is the book itself? I mean, the story.
I think the book in many ways it's a message in a bottle, in the sense that we're tossing it out to the sea and we will see who receives it. I like that idea of the audience completing. I was thinking, as listening to the two of you, Edward and Kim, as you spoke, just thinking, wow, there's so many facets of engagement with this project. You know, people will come who are fans of Edward's, they'll come who are fans of Kim's, they'll come through the museum space, they'll come through our website. So it really is this multifaceted project. But I began to think about the book in relation to Benjamin and the original and the copy, and thinking about how this project dances so elegantly between an experience of something in real life. I mean, Kim, you were speaking about encountering the statue in the gallery as a experience of the body. And so the book, in printing it, becomes a copy of copies of copies. And again, that it's such a, for me, I think scholars will be very interested in this project. I never, to be honest, artist books lie between disciplines, always. I mean, that's in a way the best definition of an artist book to me. And I think it's so it's so wonderful to see the seams that it will bring together. So I'm looking forward to hearing people's responses.
Yeah, that between discipline thing. I mean, it's a kind of the again the Barrett thing of the knee, the neither nor. Like it's neither this nor that, and it really, the negation I think suits it in a way, because it's like you're working against sense in so many levels, and so it is a confusing book probably to encounter, but I think it's a compendium. You know, that is a companion to the video in many ways. Like it's a sort of handbook to understand the piece. And in the book itself, there are stills of the video and a description of the video. But it definitely, I think, deepens the experience of watching the video. And on its own, I would imagine it creates a kind of confusion of like, is this real? Is this not real? Is this, you know, like, it has a kind of it I think walks a little bit of that line of between making sense and not making sense.
No, I was just going to say, you know, it's someone who's been following your career for probably over a decade now, if not longer. You know, it's interesting to me to see you move into this space, you know, and pull the importance of, like you said, there's a fantasy I think each one of us has when we've practiced for over 2 decades that we want, like, what does it mean to want, you describe making video as being 2-dimensional and wanting perhaps to enter into the 3rd dimension. And I'm interested in how a book has this, it's a linear object, but also this book isn't, in a way, that you could open it in the middle and at the end and experience it in these different ways of interacting with it. But what does creating the book, how did that expand your dimensionality of this project, if that makes any sense?
Well, it physically embodies all of the time that we spent on it, you know, like I think all that would be lost in a way. It would be a shame. So through language, you know, it reemerges as a sort of temporal experience. Yeah, and of course you hold a book in your hands. I mean, I published a journal called Material, and we don't put anything online for that reason, you know, like the text exists in tangible form, for a reason, because I think when you're reading something, when you're physically holding a book, something different happens to you. I think your experience of time shifts in a way that it doesn't when you're looking at a screen, I think. Yeah.
One of the things as a publisher, I think you might be our 9th or 10th book, but I realized that we've become very interested in publishing works that are in direct relationship to performance. And I think that having the transcript is a literal transcription of a performance. But I also, Edward, I'm so grateful to listen to your analysis of these 2 identities, because I think that in a way the art historian, this is like there's a bit of a performance happening as well. So I see this book very much in relationship to different. It's a transcription, but it's also a trace of different levels of performative intellectual endeavors.
I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more, Edward, about the relationship of the copy, because I think that I had brought Byung-Chul Han, his books to the table when I first started the project, because he's an author a philosopher, Korean born, he's a professor in Germany, who's really been an inspiration for me, and his concept of shanzai, and like I would just be curious, maybe Edward, you could talk a little bit about that, because I know in the essay that you've written about it.
Yeah, I think that those ideas became really useful for thinking, I guess, transculturally about the problem of the original and the copy, because there are sort of 2 different registers of copy. One being a kind of low copy, the one that can go everywhere and can let's say, disconnect itself from the original in all sorts of ways and still function. And then there's like the high copy, the one that's supposed to be as good as the original, or that's supposed to replace the original. This actually, I think, is very different from the idea of the original that you get out of Western art history, which is, you know, that there's really only one original that happened at a particular place at a particular time. So one thing that I explored in the essay was the fact that that's also a historical construction, that that basically you know, it wasn't always so. That there's sort of a moment when the idea of an art object as a unique object versus as an object that's essentially part of a larger chain of copies that ultimately point back towards a kind of mythological origin, which lends every copy an equal kind of charge. There's sort of a moment when a way of historical thinking emerges in the European context that has to do with locating things in specific places and times. And that on some level, the definition of the art object, in as much as it attaches itself to the idea of the original, is embedded in that moment where history wants to fasten things to their historical contexts rather than to the mythological chain that gives them meaning. And it seemed to me that we were way out on the end of that in some ways, and at the same time sort of coming back around. But that whole idea is further complicated by the fact that all of this historical and theoretical thinking is actually operating in the context of what is already to some extent the closed circle of this art object that is Baragouin, that like inside of this, that at least from the perspective of the art historian who's trying to think through these things, I'm not operating outside of the space that is enclosed by this video. The kind of, that's the realm of what is seeable and knowable. So that gets back to the kind of some of the stuff that Alexandra was just talking about, which is that, you know, the performance, understanding art historical performance is much easier to do when you circumscribe it with a kind of arbitrary and somewhat absurd boundary. You know, you're not going to go looking for these objects in the world and try to understand exactly who made them and when. You're going to operate within the realm of this video and think about what kinds of meanings are emerging from these objects, what kinds of pasts. And for me, it became, I think, I engaged in a certain mania. That's why I think the Borgesian labyrinth is such a useful analogy, because there was something manic about trying to exercise the function of the art historian within these boundaries. And it exposed also, for me, I'm often, because I'm interested in that longer history of, you know, of historicizing the idea of the original, I'm also interested in historicizing the expertise of art history. Art history, to my mind, as much as it can put its finger on certain kinds of facts, engages in a certain kind of fiction as well. It is a fictional activity on some level. There are a lot of art historians who would totally disagree with me in saying that, but I was kind of, the mania, it was involved in kind of pressing on the ways in which actually fiction emerges from the art historical apparatus, as much as it emerges from you know, the zone of this store, that one can find absurdity in either place if one presses hard enough against the apparatus itself.
Yeah, I was interested that you called it a collection, or the Baragouin collection, like the figures from the Baragouin collection. I mean, the arbitrary boundaries of the store, and then my boundaries of the video of the store. Like, there's a lot of, like, you know, boundaries there, but like that their confluence and their juxtaposition was part of why it's such a fascinating place. And that already is arbitrary to begin with, like how they ended up with the statuaries and sculptures that are in the store seems arbitrary. And that what I mentioned earlier about like, oh yes, that we have an identification key, which Ella Gold did a beautiful job in. She outlined all the figures and numbered them. They all have identification numbers, each figure, so you can track them.
It's that image is a diagram that proposes to give you a kind of rational understanding of what's there. It numbers things, it gives you outlines, it gives you all sorts of information that makes you believe that you ought to be able to understand what it represents. But you almost can't. There's never a place from which all of those things fully reconcile. And the closer you get into them, the more likely you are to encounter, yes, a kind of wealth of associations, but also increasingly an uncertainty about where you're landing. So I think that boundary between signal and noise, between sense and nonsense, it's like the harder you push for sense, the more cracks emerge through which nonsense can flow. And that's kind of what my experience of this project, and why I think it was performative in a sense, is that it was like an endurance piece. Like I continually had to return to the idea that I could make sense out of something, knowing full well that I would always be bumping up against more and more nonsense, and trying to navigate these two things. Because we were going back and forth a lot with the writing. I would send you something and then you'd say, oh, this part's really funny. And then, oh, but this part's too funny. So then we would press things back. And then, there was a lot of, anyway, it was I think I think the idea of an endurance piece, like that you have to keep at every step of the way, you're trying to make sense out of something with these different tools that you have to purportedly make sense. And at each step, the better you use the tool, the more nonsense emerges.
Yeah, this kind of mania to me is like Georges Perec, another author that has really influenced me. The Species of Space is another Pieces book. The more you apply this kind of, he calls it a kind of fascination for enumeration, like, which is, like the more we make collections and organizational structures to manage our understanding of things, like that's how we cope, basically. That's how we learn, that's how we get through the world. And those that impulse to categorize and separate and to understand in sort of compartments what means what, has rubbed up against the kind of ridiculousness of the endeavor in the larger sense of the artwork. So I think that's what the book brings out, really, is like the attempt to do it is there, and then, what emerges is maybe not as clear cut as what would emerge if you took the whole project as, if you believed that you could learn from categorization, then, a different set of engagements arise, than if you engage with this book. Like, I think about like August Sander a lot, and, his typologies, and I've written about that, like that you could write sociology with images, is a kind of maybe a fiction that I don't subscribe to, like that, that there's always the observer that's involved in that, and there's always biases that you bring to it. So our biases are showing maybe in this work, which is what I liked about it. Yeah. And Edward, just as a note, when you were describing how you felt engaging with this project, I've had this said to me before with the actors in the pieces of like Consider This Scrimmage and like the other nonsense works. Like, it is a very frustrating endeavor to work against sense, or like to come up on those borders. Like, I've actually had actors like freak out and walk off the set, because basically my role as a director in those pieces is always just to yell cut when it's making too much sense. And that often happens, you know, because it's really hard to do. I couldn't do it to influence them or to tell them what I was looking for. And very few people can do it in general to maintain this kind of tightrope walk between meaning and non-meaning. And it's frustrating. It's basically a frustrating process, and it's agitating. And so I feel like kind of weird hearing you say that, because then I think, oh, is there some kind of masochism involved in this project?
Of course there is. I mean, I think
Edith mentioned megalomania, and I'll throw in another M word, the masochism of the artist.
I think there's masochism involved in
and mania.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that it had never occurred to me before listening to the two of you that the book in itself is almost like the relationship between the artist and the curator is what's being explored, right? That, and this is me speaking less as the publisher and as another artist in the room, but that experience you have when you are working with a curator and you're, you know, writing the history of the work that you've just made, and you're, you know, setting it up but there's a dance between, you know, a curator will say, well, the work is about this, and you'll say, well, not exactly, or yeah, so I'd never thought about it that way. So there's this dance, and I really see this book almost like exposing the limits and the play that happen between the historicizing that happens in real time as a contemporary artist, and like how interpretation happens from the curator to the artist, and the artist will say, no, not really, or, you know, can you talk a little bit? I do feel like this is almost a play of an artist and curator within the structure. Like, how did Edward affect your view of the installation itself? You know,
the installation meaning the video presentation?
Yeah. Because you're almost upending that relationship, but you're playing it out in a more public view, if that makes any sense. Normally it's what's concealed is the historicizing that happens when you do a show as an artist at a museum. That part is concealed, and you're revealing the relationship.
Well, it's weird because, you know, when the idea that when you're writing an artist statement, for example, that you're only illuminating your own blind spots, you know, it's like what I say just reveals everything that everyone else is seeing that I don't. And so I think it's only in confrontation with others that what you're doing is revealed. And that's why I love the productivity of working with Ida and Marcel as curators, and with Edward as a writer and art historian. I love working with Ella, the designer, because I think, you know, things get revealed about what you're doing. Like, you may try to historicize yourself, but I don't think you would do a very good job of it. I think you would probably miss everything that you were doing. I mean, you know, having gone to CalArts where everything had to be articulatable and defendable and argued to within an inch of its life. And, you know, as an artist, you're supposedly in full possession of all of the meanings that your work is generating. And that, you know, I mean, that's a fiction as well. I mean, I'll talk a blue streak. I mean, we could keep talking about it, but I don't think that I would be able to encapsulate the accidents that occur, the missense that occurs, the things that I miss in making it, you know, like whatever my intentions are. And that's why I think of myself as more of an experimenter whose work comes out in the friction and collaborations with others, you know, because you set in motion something and you can't really see where it's going. And that to me is the pleasure of being an artist, is like to follow those twists and turns and see where you'll end up, you know. It's a way of living that I enjoy, because I don't want to pin down everything, you know. Like, I would like to see what emerges in combination with others and with ideas.
I think it's a very nice moment to end. You just made your real artist statement as a closing phase. And I just would like to thank for your contribution and your company this evening. Thank you so much.